Brad Delp was never the kind of rock star who wore his demons on his sleeve. He seemed so gentle and unassuming that many fans, upon meeting him, found it hard to reconcile that this was the famed vocalist behind Boston, one of the biggest selling debut rock acts in history. With that boyish half-smile and the kind demeanor that made people call him the nicest guy in rock, he could have been anyone's friendly neighbor or the favorite uncle at a family get-together. But behind the scenes, for decades, Brad Delp carried a sadness that only deepened as time went on. When he died by suicide in March 2007, it came as a shock to many. How could this quietly charismatic man take such a tragic step? Yet a closer look at the pressures, heartbreaks, and inner battles that haunted his life reveals a story far darker and more complicated than the polished stage persona and the silver-voiced ballads might have hinted at. He had struggled with depression for a very long time, even since his teenage years, not that he wore it openly. Those who knew him well described him as someone who always wore a warm smile, who gave so much to charitable causes, who showed deep empathy for friends and strangers alike. Underneath that generosity, though, lurked persistent thoughts of self-harm. In his suicide note, he referenced how suicidal ideation had first visited him back when he was still a kid. He wrote about how it stayed in one form or another all the way through adulthood. This was hardly the image the public saw, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, when he was the frontman for Boston, singing More Than a Feeling in that perfect, airy tenor. But as is often the case with depression, it never left him entirely. It receded at times, only to come roaring back whenever turmoil arrived. And turmoil had an uncanny way of finding him, or at least following him, into the most private corners of his life. In his final note, Delp scribbled a line of French, J'ai une âme solitaire, or I am a lonely soul. It was a quiet cry that summed up not only his last hours, but the sorrow that had followed him for years. One rarely discussed aspect of his personal life was a long-term estrangement from his older sister Carol. In the 1970s and 1980s, while Brad was busy chasing music dreams and eventually hitting it big with Boston, his relationship with Carol disintegrated. Some say it was a clash of personalities. Others point to how the family responded differently to Brad's success. She stayed more rooted in everyday life while he toured across the country. Regardless of the root cause, they ended up barely communicating for long stretches, leaving a hole in Brad's sense of family. Carol later expressed regret to the Boston Globe, mourning the fact that she never patched things up with him. It's easy to see how this sense of detachment from people he loved, combined with his natural inclination toward guilt and worry, would deepen the lonely edges of his psyche. He had all the trappings of stardom, but even from early on, he felt set apart. That dissonance became especially stark when success exploded around him. The band's 1976 self-titled album, Boston, sold over 17 million copies and became a staple of 70s rock radio. Guitarist Tom Scholz's meticulous production and Delp's shimmering vocals were key to that meteoric success, with hits like More Than a Feeling, Long Time, and Peace of Mind. The group was nominated for Grammys, soared up the Billboard charts, and became one of the most iconic rock acts of that era. But behind the scenes, Delp's finances never matched the public's idea of rock star prosperity. He and his bandmates had signed deals that gave Tom Scholz, the band's founder and mastermind, far more control over the purse strings. Delp, for all his contribution, found himself pulling in modest earnings relative to the album's massive sales. He relied largely on touring to support his family, which left him exhausted. It also kept him further from the people he most wanted to be near, including his sister, from whom he was drifting, and later from his own children. The looming presence of Tom Scholz added another layer of tension. Schultz was widely known as a perfectionist and the undisputed leader of Boston, an engineer, inventor, and studio wizard. But this role sometimes bled into controlling behavior, leaving Delp feeling overshadowed. Tom Schultz oversaw the finances, the creative direction, and the band's business negotiations with an iron grip. To many outside observers, the synergy between Schultz and Delp was magical. One had the giant guitar riffs and studio brilliance. The other had that angelic voice. But inside, tensions simmered. Delp felt he lacked the ability to negotiate better contract terms without incurring legal trouble. Schultz had built a reputation for litigating disputes with band members who tried to question him. When you add Delp's gentle, conflict-averse nature to this dynamic, you can imagine how powerless he felt. He was the man behind the microphone, but not in the driver's seat. Friends reported that Delp often confided in them that he felt held back, that he was basically at Schultz's mercy, and that the sense of being used, yet not fairly rewarded, contributed to his stress and depression. One of the biggest heartbreaks for Delp was the friction and eventual split between Tom Schultz and Barry Goudreau, another original guitarist in Boston. Barry was more than a colleague. He was Brad's close friend, a confidant who'd introduced Delp to Schultz in the first place. The dispute over songwriting credits and financial rights led to Goudreau's departure after the band's second album, Don't Look Back, 1978. Delp, caught in the crossfire, tried to remain loyal to both men, but wound up watching from the sidelines as Schultz and Goudreau parted ways. Goudreau struggled to rebuild his musical career, starting groups like Orion the Hunter that never achieved Boston-level fame. Delp felt guilty for staying with Schultz, and that guilt festered. He empathized with Goudreau's plight and lamented that he hadn't done more to protect his friend. Years later, they would reunite briefly for the group RTZ, but the wounds from that older conflict never fully healed. The RTZ era was supposed to be a fresh start for Delp. He formed the band in the early 1990s with Barry Goudreau, hoping for an environment with more musical freedom and less legal wrangling. Initially, it seemed promising. The album Return to Zero, 1991, showcased Delp's melodic chops in a way that was reminiscent of Boston, but with a more direct, rock-driven approach. Yet legal entanglements overshadowed the project. Tom Schultz sued over perceived trademark infringements, record label issues caused marketing woes, and the album's sales faltered. By 1992, RTZ had disbanded. Delp felt a keen disappointment. This was supposed to be his chance to shine on his own terms, away from the constraints of Schultz's slow, perfectionist approach. Instead, it fizzled out. With few other options, Delp found himself returning to Boston, continuing the cycle he couldn't seem to break. The sense of being trapped deepened, adding another layer of resignation to his emotional life. Delp was married and divorced twice. Little is publicly known about his first marriage, which ended quietly, but the second, with Mickey Delp, was more public. They married in 1980, had 2 children, and for a while Brad seemed to find solace in fatherhood. But that too unraveled, culminating in divorce by 1996. He never overcame the guilt of seeing his home life collapse, particularly because the marriage's breakdown coincided with ongoing tensions in Boston. Mickey later publicly stated that she believed Schultz's controlling nature played a role in Delp's mental downfall, which of course led to a defamation lawsuit from Schultz. Regardless of the lawsuit's specifics, the fact remains that Delp's second divorce left him feeling that he had failed as a husband and father. He doted on his kids, but his constant touring and conflict-avoidant nature prevented him from fully mending the fractured relationships at home. His mental health took additional hits in the 1990s due to a physical scare. Boston's promotional push for Walk On, 1994, featured an exhausting slate of live performances, with Delp as the face and voice of the band. At one point, he suffered severe vocal strain, pushing his cords to the brink. Doctors warned that if he continued at such a punishing pace, he might lose that heavenly voice forever. For someone who identified so deeply with his singing, the thought of permanent vocal damage was horrifying. He told bandmates and friends that if he couldn't sing, he wouldn't know who he was. Though he eventually recovered through vocal rest and medical treatment, that fear lingered. Every time he stepped on stage, it was with the knowledge that his golden voice could crack or vanish if he pushed too hard or if the stress levels rose too high. As the new millennium arrived, Brad sought respite in smaller, more personal projects. He joined a Beatles tribute band called Beetlejuice, which offered him a kind of pure musical joy that the big stage drama of Boston couldn't provide. And he collaborated again with Barry Goudreau, releasing a CD simply titled Delp and Goudreau in 2003. In these pursuits, he found a breath of fresh air. Yet the old tensions with Boston never fully subsided, nor did his depression. The band would occasionally regroup, either for new recordings or tours, but each cycle left Delp grappling with the same sense of being overshadowed. The friction with Schultz might go quiet for a while, but always flared up again, often culminating in arguments over finances or control. In his personal life, some glimmers of happiness appeared. He became engaged to a woman named Pamela Sullivan, and they made wedding plans for the summer of 2007. On the surface, it looked like he might finally find stable ground. But that would soon be undone by a deeply unsettling incident in late February 2007, just 9 days before his death. Brad Delp, in what he later called a bizarre out-of-character mistake, installed a hidden camera in the bedroom of his fiancee's sister, Meg Sullivan. Meg discovered it, fled the house, and confided in her boyfriend, who demanded that Delp come clean. Distraught, Delp wrote emails apologizing but also showing mounting panic and shame. He was convinced that if Pamela discovered the full truth, it would end their relationship. That, combined with the fear that this scandal might become public knowledge, pushed him deeper into despair. His final emails showed a man riddled with guilt, describing how he'd lost control of his rational mind. He even purchased materials that indicated he was thinking about suicide as early as that moment. So it came to pass that on March 9, 2007, Brad Delp carried out a meticulously planned act of self-destruction. He sealed off his bathroom with duct tape, placed charcoal grills in the bathtub, and lit them, producing lethal carbon monoxide. He also had a backup plan involving hooking up a hose to his car's tailpipe. By the time his fiancée realized something was wrong, it was far too late. She found him on the bathroom floor, an unmistakable scene of carbon monoxide poisoning. He left multiple notes, some for his children, some for friends, some for the world. One pinned to his shirt read, "Mr. Brad Delp, j'ai un âme solitaire, I am a lonely soul." Another apologized to Meg and her boyfriend, taking the blame for the hidden camera fiasco. He wrote that he had become so ashamed that he couldn't see a way out, that he felt he had lost the will to live. In the immediate aftermath, the rock world was stunned. Boston's official website went dark, replaced by a simple message, "We've just lost the nicest guy in rock and roll." News outlets ran stories about how he'd been preparing for a Boston summer tour, how he had a wedding on the horizon. Fans were baffled. How could someone with so much going on end it all? But those who knew him intimately were less surprised, acknowledging how fragile he'd been for a long time. Over the next months, Boston's band leader Tom Schultz and Delp's ex-wife Mickey clashed publicly, each hinting that the other bore some responsibility. Schultz would sue newspapers for defamation over claims that his behavior caused Delp's suicide. The lawsuits went on for years, with courts ultimately ruling that the claims were opinions, not facts, and so not legally actionable. Meanwhile, the heartbreak remained. Even Barry Goudreau, who'd parted ways with Schultz decades earlier, expressed sorrow that Delp died feeling so isolated. In one final posthumous note, Goudreau released a song in October 2007 featuring Delp's vocals, "Rockin' Away," a track they had recorded in mid-2006, a kind of autobiography of Delp's life in music. That track hit number 20 on the rock charts in early 2008, a bittersweet tribute to what might have been had Delp found the help he needed. Then there was the question of why. Why would a man revered for his warmth and famed for his soothing voice decide to take his life in such a methodical manner? People who read his final letters saw that shame over the hidden camera incident played a huge role in his last days. But was that the only factor? Likely not. Depression doesn't spring up from a single crisis. It had shadowed him for decades, fueled by feelings of inadequacy. He wrote that the fiasco with the camera was beyond his character, but perhaps it was a symptom of a deeper turmoil. Fear of losing someone he loved, fear that everything was spiraling out of control. The older heartbreaks, his divorces, his fights with Schultz, the financial pressures, the fractured relationships with his sister, were all bricks in a wall that eventually sealed him off from hope. His funeral brought an outpouring of grief from fans, friends, and fellow musicians. Many spoke of how unassuming he was, how he'd meet fans after a show and give them time and attention. He never displayed the aloofness of a star with a multi-platinum record. To the public, he was simply the voice of more than a feeling. But to those around him, he was a man who quietly carried a mountain of stress, guilt, and longing. Boston continued on in various forms, but without Delp's voice, it was never the same. Tom Schultz and the band organized a tribute concert that summer called Come Together, a tribute to Brad Delp, aiming to celebrate his life rather than dwell solely on the tragedy. The show was emotional, with all sorts of luminaries performing and paying respects to the man with the golden voice. The crowd was full of fans who had grown up with Boston's songs echoing across their teenage bedrooms, wedding receptions, and road trip playlists. They came to say goodbye to a beloved figure who should have had many years left to sing. There's a painful irony in how the band that soared so high, the band that ironically sang about peace of mind, was haunted by internal strife and overshadowed by tragedy. For Tom Schultz, the lawsuits and the blame-laying continued for years, culminating in legal battles that the Supreme Court even declined to revisit. For Barry Goudreau, losing his longtime friend underscored how ephemeral their chance at a stable musical partnership had been. For Mickey and the children, there was heartbreak, as well as bitterness at the circumstances that they believe contributed to Brad's breakdown. For fans, the shock of losing him in such a sudden, painful manner remains fresh, even after more than a decade, and yet the music still stands. More Than a Feeling remains a staple of classic rock radio, the opening acoustic chords instantly recognizable before Delp's voice climbs into that impossibly sweet falsetto. The same voice that warmed so many hearts, ironically, was attached to a man who felt he failed those closest to him. That voice was the ticket to stardom, but also part of what kept him entangled in a band environment that triggered constant stress and left him feeling powerless. Still, if there's any small grace to glean from this tragedy, it's that Delp's artistry continues to bring joy to new generations. Perhaps that's the best tribute we can pay him, to let the song speak to our hopes and longings, acknowledging that the gentle soul behind them was fighting battles he ultimately couldn't win. In reflecting on Brad Delp's final months, we see the heartbreak of a man undone by his own mistakes and the external demands placed upon him. The hidden camera incident was a horrifying slip into paranoia or misguided coping. He wrote that he couldn't explain why he'd done it, that it contradicted his entire sense of self. Yet it was enough, combined with the weight of everything else, to drive him to set out a chilling, carefully orchestrated suicide plan. The leftover notes describing Plan A and Plan B, the taped-off bathroom, the charcoal grills, these paint a picture of a mind left with no illusions, no faint optimism. For a man whose voice had soared above stadium crowds, that final hush was devastating. Those who found him that day will never forget the scene, nor will fans forget the jolt of reading the headlines about the Boston singer's suicide. Meg Sullivan, the sister of his fiancée, was presumably in shock that the fiasco with the camera had triggered such a dire outcome. Everyone who knew him had their own unique heartbreak, and fans worldwide wept, left to wonder how the man who seemed so gentle and giving could slip away so tragically. In the final analysis, Brad Delp's life story offers a blend of luminous talent and private despair. He gave the world some of the most iconic rock vocals ever laid down on tape, then spent decades wrestling with a depression that sprang from old family rifts, never-ending band tensions, financial woes, and heartbreak in relationships. He did his best to maintain an image of benevolence and positivity, but in the end, the swirl of shame, culminating in that hidden camera incident, prompted him to cross a line from which there was no return. The more we learn about the details, the more we see that his story echoes that of so many other artists who've taken their own lives while seeming outwardly stable. Fame can't cure personal anguish. Money doesn't erase an internal sense of inadequacy.